High Moon. The young boy huddled up against the splintery, decaying barrels in a vain attempt to shelter from the bitter chill of the nighttime air. He scraped his tattered rags tight as his limbs juddered involuntarily. It had not always been like this. Once there had been a house. Once there had been a father. Once there had been warm, satisfying food filling his belly. Once their mine had thrived in Salem. Now there was just the harsh, unforgiving cold. Sleep refused to grant him merciful release, so he sat and watched the others on the platform. The guard, dusty and pompous, patrolled his small realm, occasionally glancing at the cracked clock as it clunked the long, cold minutes away. An old-timer sat on a bench, gripping his wooden cane, blind to the desolate reality that surrounded him, his enfeebled mind captured by the memory of glory days long past. Then there was the mangy old mutt that kept itself to itself and scavenged from the scraps of those who passed it by, with or without a swift kick. The boy felt the wooden barrels start to tremble and glanced up at the ancient clock. The large finger was nearing the top and the small digit was off to the left. The night train was approaching. Only 2 trains stopped at Salem these days, the day train and the night train. The day train took those who wished to escape, and the night train was invariably empty. No one ever actually came to Salem. No one in the right mind, anyways. The vibrations intensified and the boy saw the locomotive chugging into view, its thick plumes of steam churning up into the night sky, drifting past the sallow face of the hunter's moon. The gigantic wheels started to clatter on the iron tracks, and a whistle shrieked. Guard took his customary position at the head of the platform, his thumbs tucked into his tired old waistcoat, the drab-brown material of which had seen far more resplendent days in the man's youth, but was now just another testament to the death and decay that enveloped the terminally afflicted town. Slowly, wearily, the train rolled in, trundling to a grinding halt, gears and pistons groaning like an elderly spinster rising from a wicker chair. Then, as the steam and smoke dissipated, something quite unexpected happened in the light of the full moon. A door swung lazily open, and a boot stepped down onto the grimy platform. The boy shifted for a better view of this unlikely occurrence. There was a soft thunk as another boot joined the first, and the boy caught sight of the disembarking passenger. He stood tall and erect, a long black coat trailing down to just above his shiny, immaculately polished boots, and a flat, wide-brimmed hat secured firmly on his head. All feelings of hunger and cold fled into the dissipating steam of the giant behemoth that began to growl and churn its way back into the night. This truly was something to behold. A stranger had come to Salem. The boy watched enrapt as the stranger slung his gunny sack over his broad shoulder and turned to peer down the platform. The young lad gasped as the man's eyes lit on him for an instant before moving on to the old-timer. He felt as if someone had taken a good long look deep inside his heart and seen every bad, wicked thought that he had ever known, like the time he had wished the owners of the mine dead for shutting the pit and moving out of town, leaving his father with no income and the table with no food. They were dark eyes, so dark. The boy had never seen the like of them before. Or was it just that the man's narrow face was just so pale in contrast? The boy knew not nor cared not, as he hastily scrabbled round behind the barrel, and listened above the sound of his beating heart to the slow footsteps of the stranger walking over to where the blind man sat. The boots came to a solid halt, and a voice as dry as the desert wind asked, "Where will I find your sheriff?" The old-timer mumbled something unintelligible from behind his grizzled beard, and the stranger waited patiently for a few heartbeats before turning and walking over to the barrels where the young boy crouched, quaking in his rags. Clunk, clunk, they walked across the platform, foot after sure foot. No hesitation, no fear. Purpose filled every footfall until they stopped just a few feet away and there was total silence. The boy closed his eyes in terror and tried not to whimper. He'd never been so scared in all his life. This man was death. He had to be. Something foul and vicious emanated from him, The boy could feel tears starting to well behind his eyes, and he was sure he would pee himself when out of the blue something plopped down into his lap. He screamed and bolted forward as the object rolled onto the dirty floor. "First time I've ever seen anyone scared by an apple," came the rasping voice of the stranger. The boy opened his eyes and looked at the fruit lying in the shadows, then up at the face of the man peering down over the barrels. He seemed to be smiling, and all the dark emotions he exuded before had dissipated. The boy's stomach growled, and he snatched up the green fruit, gave it a quick polish, and bit in hungrily. The stranger nodded appreciatively and perched himself on one of the barrels, quietly watching the boy devour the sweet-tasting fruit. When every last succulent morsel had vanished, the man inquired, "Now your stomach is full? Perhaps you can tell me where the sheriff's office is?" The boy nodded. How could he have been so mistaken by this kind man? He could feel nothing but warmth and friendship rolling off of him now. It gave the same feeling as the sun did when one stretched out under its warm rays on a summer's day. "It's on the main road through the centre of town, sir," volunteered the boy, wiping apple juice from his dirty chin with the heel of his grubby hand. "Opposite the saloon. But you won't find anyone there at this time of night." The man's smile faded, and once more ice writhed its way into the boy's stomach, causing the undigested apple to somersault. "There'll be someone there, lad," the stranger growled. "They're expecting me." With that, he spun on his boot heel and walked over towards the steps at the end of the platform. The boy manoeuvred out from behind the barrels and watched the stranger disappear around the corner of the station. And suddenly there was an emptiness in his stomach that even the juiciest fruit could not fill. This man was different. He had a purpose. What that purpose was, the boy was unsure of. But he was darned if he was going to sit here shivering in the cold night air when he could be finding out. He scampered after him, his bare feet slapping against the dusty wooden boards of the platform, and paused at the edge of the building to peer around the corner. True to his word, the man was heading straight up the main street towards the centre of town, where the outline of the sheriff's office sat square and squat opposite the saloon and the general store. The boy grimaced. The sheriff was a spiteful man by the name of Carson. He had not been elected to the post, but had seized it 3 years ago, when the vacancy had arisen following the untimely death of its previous occupant. Carson had been a stranger to town, having ridden in just a few weeks previous. No one knew anything about his history, but rumours abounded. Some said that he had come from back east and left a trail of blood in his wake. Some said that he was in pay of the now defunct mining corporation. Some said he was a gunslinger who had gone bad and had decided to fashion his own little kingdom in his backwater parish. Whatever his history, whatever his aim, the boy knew one thing. Carson would not like being troubled at this time of night. Man was meaner than a hungry rattlesnake and twice as poisonous. He had surrounded himself with toadies who, when they weren't out implementing his own cruel brand of lawmaking, sat around outside the saloon, leering at the womenfolk and jeering at those with no strength to stand against them. "Carson!" The stranger's hard voice broke the boy's reverie. "Carson, I'm here. Come and face me. Justice has come to Salem this night." For a short while there was nothing. Not even the sound of an insect or a night bird. But the stranger stood expectantly outside the sheriff's office, his hands loose by the side of his long black coat. The boy's curiosity urged him forward, and he scurried down the edge of the street, desperate not to be observed, sliding under the raised footpath in front of the general store. He shuffled on his belly through dust and dirt until he gained a wide view of the street. Then, just as he hunkered down to watch the show, the sheriff's door swung open, and 3 deputies sauntered out, spreading into a thin line facing the stranger. The boy felt the atmosphere in the street was akin to how the weather felt just before a wild storm raged in from the desert. It was charged with expectant excitement. Hell was about to break loose, and there would be casualties. "You shouldn't have come here," called out one of the deputies. "This here's a quiet town." The stranger stood silent, his hand still loose by his side, his face fixed on the three men. "What's the matter?" shouted another deputy. "Can't you talk?" The boy saw the stranger's shoulders rise and fall in his long, dark overcoat. He looked from one to the other of the men facing him and said quietly, but clearly, in the still night air, "You men do not concern me. Walk away, and there will be no blood shed here tonight." He lowered his gaze to the street floor in front of him, apparently content to just study a small stone that was impacted in the road's dusty surface. First there was silence. Then there was a bray of laughter. "You sure got some balls, stranger," the first deputy mocked. "There's three of us, only one of you. The only blood likely to be shed is yours." His fellows joined in the rough, callous laughter, which echoed through the empty street, till the stranger did one simple thing. He looked up from the stone he had been studying in front of his highly polished boot. In the dim light, the boy could see the danger in his dark, shadowed eyes. So too could the unwise deputies, and one of them made for his gun, swiftly followed by the others. Shots rang out, the boy could not tell how many, and the acrid perfume of lingering smoke hung in the cool night air. The stranger still stood exactly where he had before, unmoved, uninjured. The boy's eyes were almost as wide as those of the deputies. This was unbelievable. He had clearly been shot a number of times, as scorched, bloodied holes in his clothes bore witness. But he was not even betraying as much as a slight sway to his stance. The three deputies stood aghast, the guns wavering in their undecided grips. They were clearly at a loss. Then three distinct shots rang out, and the three men dropped down, dead. The boy swung his eyes back from the bloody corpses, which now all bore three precise headshots, to the stranger who remained standing in exactly the same fashion, the only difference being that a vague pall of gun smoke now encircled him. The boy gave an involuntary squeak, and the stranger spared him a glance before calmly striding over to the warm corpses and inspecting his handiwork with the point of his boot. He sighed sadly before raising his head, closing his eyes, and breathing in deep of the dead air. There was a muffled crashing noise as something was either dropped or fell over in the sheriff's office. At once, the gunslinger's eyes shot open, and his head snapped towards the municipal building. Then it was a blur, a streak of black crashing through the solid wooden door. The boy scrambled along under the raised walkway for a better look at what was going on. There were more crashes, which were accompanied by shouts and followed by an almighty scream as the sheriff came flying backwards through the ground floor window, pieces of splintered wood and smashed glass cascading alongside him onto the street. The heavy-set man rolled and clawed his way to his feet. He shouted and swore in a tremulous high voice at the sight of his dead deputies as he fumbled for his gun. The watching boy cringed. He knew it would be hopeless for the man. As the stranger emerged steadily out of the broken doorway, the sheriff fired off shot after panicky shot. Some may have hit the impervious hunter. Some may have just gone wide. The boy could not tell. All he was sure of was that the sheriff was as dead as his deputies. "Carson!" roared the stranger as he stalked his way down onto the dusty street. "Your time here is finished. I have come for you, you abomination." Carson, panic-stricken, shifted frantically from side to side, saw there was no help coming from the town he had righteously screwed for the last 3 years, threw his useless gun at the stranger and made a break for it. At least he tried to. The stranger leapt off his feet and glided through the air with his black coat flapping bat-like behind him. He descended on the back of the fleeing sheriff, dropping him to the floor like a hungry cougar downing a stricken buffalo. "Justice is served," hissed the stranger, then threw back his head before seeming to ram his face down into Carson's neck. The boy frowned. All he could see from his low vantage point was the rear of the stranger with his shoulders hunched over in his long coat. But he could hear. He could hear all too well. Carson was screaming. He was shrieking and begging for his life. First there was shouting and cursing. Then there was pleading. Then pure, unadulterated terror, followed by pathetic, weakened, whimpers. Then there was silence. The silence was the worst of all. When he had finished the deed, whatever it had been, the stranger stood up straight and brushed himself down. Piqued curiosity was getting the better of the boy once more, and emerged from his hiding place for a better look. The stranger was covered in a fine powdery substance that looked for all intent and purposes like dried clay. The boy frowned, then gasped, when he saw the remains of Sheriff Carson. All that was left were his clothes, and a withered, powdery remnant of a cadaver. The boy tentatively approached the desiccated form and gingerly prodded the skull with his finger. His stomach lurched as the dry, fragile skull collapsed under his touch. He turned, and an unspoken question formed on his lips. "You don't want to know?" the stranger said, in no more than a whisper. He suddenly seemed tired, weary, as if he had just exerted himself to a great extent. He turned on his heel and began to walk away. "Wait!" called out the boy. The stranger stopped, but did not turn. "Who will be our sheriff now? You?" Another sigh shrugged the shoulders of the black coat. "Not me." "Then who?" The stranger walked over to his gunny sack, picked it up and said, "That is for all of you good people to decide," before continuing to walk off to the edge of town. "I have to find somewhere where I can rest now, somewhere—" He paused as if searching for the word. "Undisturbed." The boy glanced around the street that was empty of all life except for himself and the stranger. All he had for company was 4 corpses. No one else had come to investigate the gunshots and screams. Not even a curtain had flickered. He was alone. The stranger had reached a point where the main street met the edge of the town. He stood pondering his options under the hunter's moon, which had now begun its descent towards the horizon. "I know of a place that might suit you," the boy called after the stranger. The stranger turned, and his eyes bored into the youngster with interest. "A cave not far from here," the boy continued, walking up to the stranger. "It is very private. I could take you. Once you walk with me, there'll be no turning back. You realize that, don't you?" The stranger's voice was doleful, yet the boy could sense there was just a trace of hope in there. The youngster nodded, so did the stranger. No more words passed between them as they walked out into the desert and left the town behind them.